top diplomats of South Korea, Japan and China met in the southern port city of Busan on Sunday to address issues of regional interest, including those related to trade and prospects of a trilateral summit in the near future. Hello and welcome to Tuesday's edition of Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sunhee. Foreign ministers representing East Asia met for trilateral talks in Korea's southern port city of Busan this past weekend for the first time in more than 4 years. For more on the issues addressed, I have Professor Choo Jae-woo at Kyung Hee University live on the line. Professor Choo, it's good to have you on.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Right. I also have Mister Frank Jannuzi, at the head of the Maureen and Mansfield Foundation, with us as well. Mr. Jannuzi, it's great to speak with you again.
Good afternoon to everyone in Seoul.
Professor Choo, what do you believe are the most important takeaways from this latest trilateral diplomatic gathering among South Korea, Japan and China?
Yes, I would say, there are about 3 takeaways that we can make from the, recently held trilateral talks in Busan. One is, I would say, the foremost priority in Chinese foreign policy is definitely China-U.S. relations from Chinese perspective. And the second is, I think it reflected the current state of address of the, not only Korea and China relations, but also Japan and China relations. I think that was one of the critical factors that the Koreans have overlooked over the past few months. And I think, the very fragile Japan-China relationship at this stage has driven a wedge to this falter of trilateral summit meeting that was scheduled to be held in Korea this year. And lastly, the state of Korea-China relations, as I just pointed out, I think it reflected that China is no longer appreciate as much as it did this relationship with South Korea a few months ago, when everything was murky about about the prospect of U.S.-China summit meeting that the United States was hoping to have at recently concluded APEC in San Francisco just this month. And obviously, South Korea has lost some of its grounds that could have facilitated its relationship with China moving forward.
Right, and before we delve into the specifics of some of the issues that Professor Choo has touched upon, Mr. Jannuzi, I ask you, what do you care to highlight from the trilateral talks that recently took place in Busan?
Well, on the plus side, it's the first trilateral since COVID. So it's been 4 years since we've had this kind of a gathering of the 3 Asian countries that lead the region. And that's a step in the right direction. And the 3 countries also agreed to expedite a summit meeting among the 3, President Xi Jinping, President Yoon, and Prime Minister Kishida. But they were unable to agree on an early date. So I think it's going to take some time for that trilateral summit meeting to take place. I was also a little bit encouraged by a couple of data points. One is that the 3 countries want to increase exchanges. I would note that there are only 350 U.S. students currently studying in China. We haven't seen a number that low since I was a student in China back in the 1980s. There used to be thousands of Americans studying in China, and there are almost 300,000 Chinese studying in the United States. So the absence of exchanges bodes very ill for the future of the relationship. So I think it's good that China, Korea, and Japan pledged to try to increase the number of exchanges. And there's also some encouraging takeaways on climate change. I'll be headed to COP28 for the Mansfield Foundation later this week. And I think it's very important that the 3 countries work together on the climate change issue. And it does offer one way that the 3 might begin to build some common ground on a common issue of concern.
Right, indeed. And while they have common ground on with regard to the climate and, of course, cultural exchanges, Professor Choo, how do you explain China's response with regard to North Korea's satellite launch?
The Chinese response was same old lines, to show restraints and demanding restraints on the Korean side, and the North Korean side, and we're asking them to be responsible with this action, and the response has been the same since the first nuclear crisis back in the 1990s, and I don't think we can give too much meaning to this Chinese response, in recent times. And at the same time, I like to turn a little bit, get off a little bit of the focus on China's response to North Korea's satellite launch, because China is not showing any kind of restraints that could be, responsible for, the peace and stability in this region, because China has been testing its own ballistic missiles, annually more than 100 times since 2019, and it has been also launching, satellites like 50 to 70 times annually. So who's to tell who to show restraints and be responsible with its action? So I don't think we can give too much meaning to China's response anymore.
Right. And Mr. Jannuzi, while there are scholars and, of course, pundits like Professor Choo who believe that China's response to North Korea's provocations have been consistent over the years, other pundits claim that there's been a shift in response. And do correct me if I'm wrong, but back in the year 2012, Beijing's foreign ministry claimed that it regretted North Korea's satellite launch. But with regard to this latest satellite mission, Beijing initially simply stated that it had noticed the mission. What are your thoughts?
Well, on the one hand, I agree with Professor Choo that China has never been willing to come down very hard on North Korea in response to various North Korean provocations. And it's also true that China has in recent years adopted the stance that North Korea is somehow the victim here, and that the U.S. and South Korea are the provocateurs. But I think what is notable is that in the past, we had the opportunity for China to sign on to UN sanctions to punish North Korea for nuclear tests, for ballistic missile tests. And that is no longer applicable. It's clear that the Chinese have no intention of allowing the UN either to impose any new sanctions or even strong condemnations on North Korea. And perhaps worse, the Chinese are actually finding ways to evade the sanctions that they themselves signed on to. So I think redressing this, trying to correct China's behavior should be one of the top priorities for the South Korean and Japanese leaders if they sit down with Xi Jinping. But they're going to need to offer something in exchange. There's going to need to be some way that China can say to the North Koreans, look, the international community isn't going to tolerate your violation of UN sanctions, but if you start to behave more responsibly, there could be some benefit for your nation.
Right, and staying with prospects about a trilateral summit among the leaders of South Korea, Japan and China, Professor Choo, as you mentioned earlier, there were hopes for these talks to take place within this year. Now officials here in the country are hoping to open the talks early next year. What are your thoughts with regard to prospects of such a meeting?
I got to be pessimistic once again. I'm sorry, Sonny, but listen, the way especially the way the Japan-China relationship is going, I don't think we can bet any hopes on the prospects of trilateral summit, let alone the current state of Korea-China relations. We look at over the past. In the past, there were 4 occasions that China unilaterally canceled the trilateral summit in the past, and China on all of the occasions, deferred the responsibility to South Korea's deployment of THAAD in 2016 and 2017, and Japan's Japanese Prime Minister paying tribute to Yasukuni Shrine in 2013 and 14. And now you look at, to Japan, I think with, China sentencing a Japanese businessman for 12 years in prison term. I think this is where I don't think any hopes that can get, that Japan can place any hopes on the, improving relationships before the Trilateral Summit can happen next year. So I think it might be, Japan's turn to cancel this Trilateral Summit meeting comes next year.
And perhaps because of the concerns raised by Professor Choo, Mr. Jannuzi, pundits do believe that talks among the regional leaders should perhaps include a two-track strategy, with talks on economy and those on security held separately, with more focus on trade, as it is, of course, a shared interest among members of those three countries. What are your thoughts, Mr. Jannuzi?
Well, I'd love to offer some kind of an optimistic counterpoint to Professor Choo's dreary analysis, but I have to agree with Professor Choo that the fundamentals here of the Japan-South Korea-China relationship are not sound. And so it's very tempting to imagine, okay, let's have economic talks that will be somehow less sensitive, and we'll have the security talks that are more sensitive, and we'll split them into two parts. Unfortunately, I don't think China really works that way. The Chinese tend to lump things together, and if the economic relationship is going great, but the security relationship is going poorly, the Chinese are going to consider the entire relationship to be going poorly. So I think it's really more practical nowadays to acknowledge that the economic relationship also has a security dimension. We're talking about issues like supply chain, critical minerals, export controls. These are national security issues and economic issues. So while it would be very attractive, in theory, to separate the economic issues, which should be a little less contentious, maybe, from the security issues, which right now are very troubled, I'm afraid that that may not be realistic. Probably we have to lump it all together, like the Americans have done with the Chinese in the past, with the strategic and economic dialogue, and that the three leaders in Asia should hold comprehensive, across-the-board talks to try to look at the economic issues that are difficult and at the same time try to address some of the security concerns.
Right. And beyond this trilateral arrangement, Professor Choo, speaking as a scholar, what are your thoughts, or how do you assess Seoul's current relationship with Beijing? And in what direction do you suppose should bilateral ties seek to flow?
Yes, I think we should be back to square one, and I think we got to start over again. I think the best direction would be, start engaging with China and initiate dialogue with China. And, the United States has been doing it, and I think the United States was quite successful as we have witnessed with the summit at the APEC this month. And despite the difficulties and problems that Japan confronts with China, Japan never stopped engaging and talking to China at all, since going back to last March. Although Japan didn't get what it wanted, and it compelled Kishida's administration to replace his foreign minister, but they're still Japan is still engaging with China and still talking to China, and I think we should also be really a little bit more proactive in pursuit of dialogue and engagement with China. I don't think it's going to take us anywhere if we don't do any of these engagement or dialogue with China. And I think this is the right direction that dialogue and engagement would take us with China. And I think we have no other choice at this stage. If we want something like trilateral summit or Korea-China summit to happen next year.
Right, so a more proactive policy, especially if it wants China's support, perhaps, with regard to North Korea's security threats. And that being said, Mr. Jannuzi, what are the broader implications of a North Korean presence in space, given its recent successful satellite launch?
Well, thanks for that question. I'm not very concerned about the images that North Korea may take of American or South Korean military bases because, quite frankly, there are commercially available satellite images of the naval base at Norfolk or U.S. Army base at Camp Humphreys. What I'm more concerned about is what the space launch signals about North Korea's long-term intentions to continue its development of long-range missile technology and to operate in space in a way that might present an asymmetric threat to the United States. The United States, South Korea, and Japan all depend on space for our economies and for our national security. We have thousands of satellites in space. North Korea has one satellite in space, but they have the potential to disrupt. They can use anti-satellite weapons that they may be able to develop now that they can reach space. They can try to jam satellites using electronic jamming from space. So I think what this satellite launch most signifies is the determination of the North Koreans to work on the ability to disrupt the dominance that the U.S. has enjoyed in space for decades, and to try to deprive the United States and its allies of the great strategic advantage that we enjoy through our dominance in space. So that's what concerns me most.
Right. Professor Choo, there is very strong belief that North Korea's success with regard to its latest satellite mission was owing to technical assistance from Russia. That being said, how do you suppose is Beijing taking in this active collaboration between Pyongyang and Moscow, do you think?
Oh, I think Beijing is a little bit worrisome here because while Beijing is really conscious of its relationship with Washington, I think that has what separated the distance between Beijing and Pyongyang, and prompted Pyongyang to be a little bit closer to Moscow. But I think Russia has been quite an actor here to this success of North Korea's latest mission, satellite mission, that is, because following the September summit meeting between Putin and Kim Jong-un in Vladivostok, and having visited all these space mission facilities, in October, Putin dispatched a group of 18 space satellite technicians to Pyongyang, and I think that tremendously helped Pyongyang to complete its satellite mission. So, Beijing should be rather more or less very, conscious and very worrisome about the, development that is going on in the bilateral relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang, and that's the very best taste that China wants to have in the trilateral relationship.
Right. Mr. Jannuzi, with regard to North Korea's provocations, there are some pundits who believe that the prospects of a nuclear test in the near future may be quite high, especially keeping in mind the failings of the United Nations Security Council. If there is a nuclear, what are your thoughts with regard to the prospects of a nuclear test by North Korea in the near future? And should that occur, what response measures do you propose?
Well, I was in Beijing about 15 years ago when North Korea tested its second nuclear weapon. And I recall vividly the conversations I had with Chinese officials at the time. And China was very hopeful, and I think overly optimistic about their ability to convince North Korea not to test nuclear weapons a second time. And And of course, we all know what has transpired. North Korea has launched a campaign of nuclear weapons testing, and it's a campaign that they are unlikely to stop. And I think what the international community needs to realize is that waiting for a North Korean test and then inevitably attempting to impose new sanctions or condemnations through the international system on North Korea is an ineffective way. It's not an effective way at all to dissuade North Korea from proceeding to develop nuclear weapons. Their nuclear weapons program is a strategic commitment of the regime to build an asset that is important not only for their international security, but also for their domestic security. So if we wish them to change course, the international community needs to act now ahead of a test, not after a test. And the form that that action should take would be diplomatic, and it should be a concerted multilateral diplomatic effort. And I think this, again, should be a top priority for a trilateral South Korea, Japan, China summit, but it really calls for a quadrilateral effort, a four-party effort involving the United States as well. And there needs to be both a clear warning to North Korea of what the consequences would be, as well as an offer to North Korea about what the benefits could be if they begin to modify their behavior. Unfortunately, as this conversation this afternoon has already pointed out, achieving such a breakthrough with China, given the current state of relations between the US and China and among China, Japan, and South Korea, would prove extraordinarily difficult. So there's important diplomatic work that needs to get done as soon as possible to strengthen those relationships so that we can speak more or less with one voice to North Korea, both about the threat of a nuclear test in terms of what it would do to bring about more punishment, but also the opportunity about what could be achieved if North Korea begins to behave more responsibly.
Right. I think the words of wisdom that come to mind as I listen to you talk, Mr. Jannuzi, was prevention is better than cure, and a more proactive stance, as Professor Choo mentioned earlier, is prerequisite here. All right, Mr. Jannuzi, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts, and Professor Choo, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. 감사합니다.
Right. Well, that brings us to the end of this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.